Part 1, Chapter 2, Assent considered as apprehensive. I have already said, as an act of assent, first that it is in itself the absolute acceptance of a proposition without any condition, and next that in order to its being made, it presupposes the condition not only of some previous inference in favor of the proposition, but especially of some concomitant apprehension of its terms. I proceeded to the latter of these two subjects, that is, of assent considered as apprehensive, leaving the discussion of assent as unconditional for a later place in this essay. The apprehension of a proposition, I mean, as I have already said, the interpretation given to the terms of which it is composed. When we infer, we consider a proposition in relation to other propositions. When we assent to it, we consider it for its own sake and in its intrinsic sense. That sense must be in some degree known to us, else we do but assert the proposition. We in no wise assent to it. Assent I have described to be a mental assertion. In its very nature, then, it is of the mind, and not of the lips. We can assert without assenting. Assent is more than assertion, just by this much, that it is accompanied by some apprehension of the matter asserted. This is plain, and the only question is, what measure of apprehension is sufficient? And the answer to this question is equally plain. It is the predicate of the proposition which must be apprehended. In a proposition, one term is predicated of another. The subject is referred to the predicate, and the predicate gives us information about the subject. Therefore, to apprehend the proposition is to have that information, and to assent to it is to acquiesce in it as true. Therefore, I apprehend a proposition when I apprehend its predicate. The subject itself need not be apprehended per se in order to a genuine assent, for it is the very thing which the predicate has to elucidate, and therefore, by its formal place in the proposition, so far as it is the subject, it is something unknown, something which the predicate makes known. But the predicate cannot make it known unless it is known itself. Let the question be, what is trade? Here is a distinct profession of ignorance about trade, and let the answer be, trade is the interchange of goods. Trade, then, need not be known as a condition of assent to the proposition, except so far as the account of it, which is given in answer, the interchange of goods, makes it known, and that must be apprehended in order to make it known. The very drift of the proposition is to tell us something about the subject, but there is no reason why our knowledge of the subject, whatever it is, should go beyond what the predicate tells us about it. Further than this, the subject need not be apprehended. As far as this it must. It will not be apprehended thus far unless we apprehend the predicate. If a child asks, what is Lucerne, and is answered, Lucerne is medicago sativa of the class Diadelphia and order Dicandria, and henceforth says obediently, Lucerne is mendicago sativa, etc., he makes no act of assent to the proposition which he enunciates, but speaks like a parrot. But if he is told Lucerne is food for cattle, and is shown cows grazing in a meadow, then, though he never saw Lucerne and knows nothing at all about it, besides what he has learned from the predicate, he is in a position to make as genuine an assent to the proposition Lucerne is food for cattle, on the word of his informant, as if he knew ever so much more about Lucerne. And as soon as he has got as far as this, he may go further. He now knows enough about Lucerne to enable him to apprehend propositions which have Lucerne for their predicate, should they come before him for assent, as that field is sown with Lucerne, or clover is not Lucerne. Yet there is a way in which the child can give an indirect assent even to a proposition, in which he understood neither subject nor predicate. He cannot indeed in that case assent to the proposition itself, but he can assent to its truth. He cannot do more than assert that Lucerne is medicago sativa, but he can assent to the proposition that Lucerne is medicago sativa is true. For here is a predicate which he sufficiently apprehends. What is inapprehensible is in the proposition being confined to the subject. Thus the child's mother might teach him to repeat a passage of Shakespeare, and when he asked the meaning of a particular line, such as "the quality of mercy is not strained," or "virtue itself turns vice," being misapplied, she might answer him that he was too young to understand it yet, but that it might had a beautiful meaning, as he would know one day, and he, in faith on her word, might give his assent to such a proposition, not, that is, to the line itself which he had got by heart, and which would be beyond him, but its being true, beautiful, and good. Of course, I am speaking of assent itself and its intrinsic conditions, not of the ground or motive of it. Whether there is an obligation upon the child to trust his mother, or whether there are cases where such trust is impossible, are irrelevant questions, and I notice them in order to put them aside. I am exclaiming the act of assent itself, not its preliminaries, and I have specified 3 directions which, among others, the assent may take, viz., assent immediately to a proposition itself, assent to its truth, and assent both to its truth and to the ground of its being true. Lucerne is food for cattle, that Lucerne is medicago sativa is true, and my mother's word that Lucerne is medicago sativa and is food for cattle is the truth. Now, in each of these there is one and the same absolute adhesion of the mind to the proposition on the part of the child. He assents to the apprehensible proposition, and to the truth of the inapprehensible, and to the veracity of his mother in her assertion of the inapprehensible. I say the same absolute adhesion, because unless he did assent without any reserve to the proposition that Lucerne was food for cattle, or to the accuracy of the botanical name and description of it, he would not be given an unreserved assent to his mother's word. Yet though these assents are all unreserved, still they certainly differ in strength, and this is the next point to which I wish to draw attention. It is indeed plain that though the child assents to his mother's veracity, and without perhaps being conscious of his own act, nevertheless that particular assent of his has a force and life in it which the other assents have not, insomuch as he apprehends the proposition, which is the subject of it, with greater keenness and energy than belongs to his apprehension of the others. Her veracity and authority is to him no abstract truth or item of general knowledge, but is bound up with that image and love of her person which is part of himself, and makes a direct claim on him for his summary assent to her general teachings. Accordingly, by reason of the circumstance of his apprehension, he would not hesitate to say, did his years admit of it, that he would lay down his life in a defense of his mother's veracity. On the other hand, he would not make such a profession in the case of the propositions Lucerne is food for cattle, or Lucerne is medicago sativa is true, or that Lucerne is medicago sativa is true. And yet it is clear, too, that if he did in truth assent to these propositions, he would have to die for them also, rather than deny them, when it came to the point, unless he made up his mind to tell a falsehood. That he would have to die for all 3 propositions severally, rather than deny them, shows the completeness and absoluteness of assent in its very nature. That he would not spontaneously challenge so severe a trial in the case of 2 out of the 3 particular acts of assent illustrates in what sense one assent may be stronger than another. It appears then that in assenting to propositions, an apprehension is, in some sense of their terms, is not only necessary to assent as such, but also gives a distinct character to its acts. If therefore we would know more about assent, we must know more about the apprehension which accompanies it. Accordingly, to the subject of apprehension I proceed.